that is. So yes, welcome everyone to week 5. Special guest Greg Buonaccorsi from the Dodgers. Super exciting. As everyone probably knows, or hopefully knows, unless you've been under a rock, the Dodgers just won the World Series in 2020. Such an unprecedented time, and it's such another exciting win for LA. So we're super excited to have Greg here, have him speak on his experience. And it's also important for everyone to know, as he's speaking, you guys can come up with different questions you may have for him about his career path, about his experience as a whole, anything you may have. And you can throw those in the chat, but we'll also have time and we'll open it up for everyone to ask questions at the end too. So welcome, Greg. How are you doing today?
Not bad. How's everybody else? Hopefully everybody's doing well. Getting ready for opening weekend, Pac-12 football, hopefully.
Yes. I think we're all finally really excited to see UCLA athletics start. As you know, it's kind of been a crisis, I think, for the sports world as a whole. And I know there's a few athletes on the call. I can give you a little background. I don't know if Johnny and Nick gave you some on the Sports Business Association, but as you know, as a UCLA alum, UCLA doesn't have any specific majors catered to the sports world. So whether that's sports management, kinesiology, sports law, sports analytics, really sports psychology, the list goes on. And we have so many students who are so passionate about the sports world. So we decided to bring this space together, especially for all the students who are interested in the sports world and us all being in a sports entertainment capital of LA. We decided it would be a good opportunity to actually form this sort of group and not only pair the lessons that we're learning and all the information we're learning in the classroom, but actually be able to pair it with building our network here at UCLA and just learning from people's personal experiences, which I have found personally to be one of the most beneficial things to do as a college student. So that's kind of how BISBA was formed. Really only, this is our 3rd year. So pretty new organization and pretty mixed too with students and student athletes. It's kind of one of a unique club settings, I guess, of demographic of it actually having the emergence of the two. A lot of things on campus are separated or segregated for students and student athletes. But this is one where you can kind of come together and athletes can share their experiences as well, which helps shape future business leaders and sports leaders. But then also students then share their experiences too to the athletes. So that's one of the unique things specifically about BISBA. So before we have you kind of share your story, we have a Who is Greg slide. We did send everyone earlier this week in our newsletter a little bit information about you, your LinkedIn, and different things like that. But just to do a refresher before we have you introduce yourself fully, like I said, he's a UCLA alumni, so I'm always going to hype that up, with a bachelor's degree in business economics. He worked as a student manager actually at UCLA for the men's basketball team who won the national championship in '95. Can't wait for our team to get like that again. Worked also in the finance departments of the Charlotte Bobcats, for NASCAR's media division and the Major League Baseball media office. So a pretty impressive resume just off there. And then currently, of course, works as the Senior Director of Financial Planning and Analysis for the 2020 World Series champions, the Los Angeles Dodgers. So without further ado, Greg, we'd love to hear more about you, kind of just like even I know you said you're from the Bay Area, I am as well, so of course we can say that. And then also just a little bit about your story and your journey to and post UCLA to the Dodgers. And
sure.
I'll stop sharing everyone.
Yeah, so unfortunately it is a very circuitous story, so I'm going to be all over the place, so I apologize for that up front, but that's one of the things that you'll need to have in place if you want to get in this industry, is that you have to basically take any opportunity you can when it presents itself, because they tend to be very few and far between. So without going too far back, I will start at UCLA. Decided that having been loving sports, but not having been an athlete in high school, still wanted to be part of a team. So actually I was a manager for my high school basketball team And as I was applying to colleges, I sent letters to the various basketball coaches saying, hey, I'm doing this in high school. Is there an opportunity to do this at the next level? Everybody wrote back pretty much saying, if you get on campus, let us know and we'll talk about it when you get here. So was down to UCLA and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And I'm not going to lie, the potential to work for the program that Coach Wooden had built pushed me a little more towards UCLA than maybe Cal Poly. So ended up coming to UCLA, constantly nagged the basketball staff when I got here to the point where they said, okay, we'll let you in. So my freshman year, I think we had actually 8 managers with the basketball team, probably a little too many. By the time we got to the point where as a senior, we actually had 5 of us, which I think was a much more manageable number. So in the meantime, working with the basketball team, business economics major. At the time, most business economics majors went into public accounting. So by the time I got through my senior year, I decided that I was going to go to work for Ernst & Young. And one of their draws was they said, well, by the way, we audit the Dodgers and the Clippers. We'll probably put you on one of those engagements. I'm not going to say that's what drove me to E&Y, but that also was a factor as well. So as I was going through my senior year, it's like, how can I meld my passion for sports along with my passion for business? Meanwhile, we get lucky and win the national championship. So made it for a very eventful senior year. After that, went to work for Ernst & Young, ended up working on the Clippers engagement. The Clippers were much different at that point than they are now. They were at the sports arena. They were horrible. Everybody's heard the Donald Sterling stories. I can say that they're pretty much true from everything that I saw for my couple of years that I spent with the Clippers doing their audit engagement. Also got a very early introduction to the importance of networking because the very young vice president of finance for the Clippers at the time was a gentleman named Dan Beckerman, which some of you may know him as a UCLA and Anderson alum who now runs AEG. So he actually ends up being one of my first mentors. So made that connection while I was there at E&Y as well. So spent about 5 years at E&Y, decided, you know what, UCLA, I never really got to do marketing. I never really got to do organizational behavior because it was a business economics degree, not that traditional business degree. So decided I wanted to go back and get my MBA and ended up going to the University of Virginia. So went back to Darden, 2 great years there getting an MBA. My internship while I was at Darden was with the San Diego Padres. They were at the time building Petco Park. So I worked with the ballpark planning department and did all kinds of fun things, mainly did a value engineering project for them during the summer where I got to call all kinds of people and say, hey, so we've got a design that the perimeter fence is going to be 12 feet. We're thinking about bringing it down to 6 feet. What do you think? And I call around to various teams around the country. I said, you know what? You may want to do more like 10 feet because if you only do 6, there's going to be some drunk people that think they can get in overnight. I think 10 will probably be a better option for you. So getting all kinds of interesting information like that and relaying it back to the team was very interesting. So did that internship, went back, finished up my MBA, didn't really find anything in sports and entertainment immediately. So I ended up working as the finance person for a small startup in Charlottesville for about a year or so. While I kept looking, didn't really see anything in sports, so I opened up the entertainment. That's when I found a spot as a financial analyst at the New York Times. So went from Charlottesville, Virginia to New York City. Spent about a year with the New York Times and had just moved over actually from the Times to Time Warner, working in their corporate department when I saw an opportunity for a director of financial planning and analysis for the Charlotte Bobcats. And almost didn't take that opportunity. I was to the point where I was kind of sick of moving around. It's like, I'm settled in New York. And I said, I'm going to always, I want to do the sports thing. I really want to do it. So ended up applying, somehow worked my way through the process and got the job. So back down to Charlotte, North Carolina. The interesting thing about that job, which people don't really realize, is that it almost was entrepreneurial in the sense that we were starting a brand new NBA team. We were running an existing WNBA team. We were building a brand new state-of-the-art arena in downtown Charlotte. And oh, by the way, since our owner was Bob Johnson, who started BET, he decided, guess what, guys, you're going to start your own regional sports network too. So having to do all of that fun stuff all at the same time made things really interesting. So I got through that process, had spent about 5 years with them. And to be completely honest, they were starting, basically the people that had hired me were let go. So I was considered part of the old regime. So when I went through that process, I didn't really want to be in that situation. So that's when I bounced over to NASCAR, which obviously has a big presence in the South. And asking a kid that grew up in California what NASCAR was like, and that telling me that I'd be working at NASCAR was something that I never, ever, ever would have expected that I would do. But once you go down to the South and see what an event it is, you understand how important it is. So went to work for them. I actually worked, as was pointed out, in what's called NASCAR Media Group, which I call basically the NFL films for NASCAR. So that was my first exposure to kind of TV production, film production. We did all the logistics for the broadcasters of the track. So you lay all the cable and bring in the production trucks and all that. So got a lot of awesome media exposure as well as some sports exposure there. So spent about 5 years with NASCAR. Realized that for me to grow at NASCAR, I need to move to Daytona Beach, and I wasn't really big about moving to Daytona Beach. So started looking for something else to do, and that's when I found an opportunity at MLB Advanced Media, which basically does all the digital work for Major League Baseball. So back to New York I went, spent about 1.5 years there, and realized, you know what, this is my second time in New York. I'm just not a New York guy, I'm a California guy. And as I was getting older and my parents were getting older, I'm an only child, so I wanted to get closer to family. And that's when the Dodgers opportunity popped up. So back out to California I came. And 6.5 years later, here I am.
I think, no, that's a really, it's funny because a lot of our guests always start off saying, you know, I went an unconventional route, or I went all over the place, like my story, but it seems like that is honestly like the norm. And it's interesting because you talk specifically about how opportunities sometimes come like so far and few between. So one question our e-board had kind of like thought about and prepped to for this call was, how did you find like in those spaces, like when you were at, even starting from back at UCLA, when you were a manager for the basketball team, how did you utilize that space to prepare for your next opportunity? Was it just how you networked there, or was it specific skill sets that you got there that helped you find these other opportunities, or how did one thing move to the next for you?
Yeah, it's kind of a moving puzzle. I mean, because it's not like a traditional industry, like a consulting industry, like when I started in public accounting, where it's basically you're going to work 3 years in this position and then you're going to get promoted, and you're going to work 5 years in this position, you're going to get promoted. And that's what, to be honest, makes it interesting. But at the same time, to answer your question, I would answer it two ways. One thing is some advice I got early in my career from Larry Lucchino, who was the president of the Padres. When I interned with the Padres, he moved on to work for the Red Sox and kind of build them up to the point where they got to when they won their World Series. He always said, you can tell me you're a Red Sox fan until you're blue in the face, but when I'm hiring a finance person, I need the best finance person I can get. So I think the first thing that you need to ask yourself is, what is it do I really want to do functionally? Do I want to be in finance? Do I want to be in marketing? Do I want to be in sales? And do everything you can and get all the experience you can to become the best within your particular area that you can. And that's probably not going to mean that you're going to get a sports job as your first job. But you will find, for the most part, a lot of us that have been fairly successful in the sports industry started somewhere else, built ourselves up to get that experience within that particular functional area. And then when we saw that opportunity in sports, we were able to move over. So that's kind of piece of advice number one. Piece of advice number two that you mentioned is, especially in sports, networking is everything. It's a very small industry. people tend to know people within the industry. I would say my last 3 or 4 jobs, the reason I got the job is because I knew somebody who knew somebody who knew the person that was hiring at that job. So any networking experience you can get is absolutely vital.
Yeah, and I think that's really true, just how you speak on focusing on the functionality of the type of thing that you want to do, and skill set that you want to do, because I think sometimes it's super easy to be like, oh, I just want to work, in sports, and I want to work for this team because I love watching the game, or, whatever it is. But I think actually critically asking yourself, well, what is the function, and what skill set, and in what ways can I build that skill set? And that opens up so many more opportunities for you as well. So I think that was a really good point. Additionally, another question related to your work now that the eBoard also prepared for you. And then there's a few questions the eBoard prepared, and then once again, I'll open it up to everyone. But especially in 2020, I know Colin was bringing up earlier about how you say athletics has totally changed. And you were mentioning about how all sports teams and all companies really have had to pivot. So for your role specifically, how has COVID-19 changed the work that you do, budget planning and forecasting from this year, and then also just moving forward?
Yeah, it's basically, and that's the fun thing about being in my position, is that budgeting and forecasting, one thing is that you're never going to be right, because you're trying to predict the future, and none of us can predict the future. And I think the thing that has changed the most is that you take that level of uncertainty and you now add on even more layers of uncertainty. And I think being able to deal with uncertainty is what keeps you sane in this situation. If you're one that can't deal with uncertainty, I'm sure you're probably having an absolute nightmare of 7 months so far, and unfortunately, probably going to have a few more. But being able to deal with uncertainty and somehow wrapping your head around that is probably the biggest thing that I've dealt with over the past 7 months. Even when I'm doing forecasts or budgets, I usually have some sort of baseline. I can look at last year and say, okay, I think this year is going to look like last year. Now I can't do that. So it's taking a concerted effort and doing, basically understanding you have to do the best of your ability, but not taking it, I don't want to say too seriously, but not holding yourself completely accountable given the uncertainty that we're dealing with.
No, that makes sense. And going back a little bit too, can you explain just what your role is and what does your day look like? I know it might have totally changed now in a COVID world, but what does your day task usually look like?
Yeah, so financial planning and analysis, basically what I do is there's a couple of different functions. One is budgeting and forecasting. So I'm the one that oversees the budget process. We have approximately 50 departments within the organization. So I have to deal with taking 50 separate individual department budgets and smashing them all together. Once the budget is done, then we typically do forecasts. So we take a look every couple of months and say, okay, this is what we said the budget is going to look like. Here's a couple of months of actuals. What do we think it's going to look like the rest of the year now that we have more information about that? So that whole process takes up a good chunk of my time. I also oversee the treasury function, so I need to make sure that we actually have enough money in the bank to pay the ridiculous salaries that we pay. So that takes a bit of time as well. So dealing with, like I said, how much is in the bank, and also back to the forecasting part of it, I need to let our CFO know how much money I think we're going to need at various times over the next 2, 3, 5 years, so he can go to our ownership and they can kind of figure out how the heck they're actually going to fund that. So do that as well. And then also all kinds of special little projects get thrown at you all the time. So that's kind of one of the good things, is that there is no such thing as a typical day, because there's always some sort of curveball that's going to get thrown at you. If there is a typical day, one of the things that does happen every day is I do the treasury stuff in the morning. So I figure out what the heck happened yesterday to see what we need to do going forward in the future. But then if I give you an example today, did the treasury stuff, then I had a Zoom call where we talked about what is becoming popular now is turning stadiums cashless. So we're looking to do the same thing at Dodger Stadium. So we're trying to figure out for the 5 to 10% of people who have cash and do not have a credit card, how are they going to be able to actually purchase things within the stadium? So we're kind of pulled together a task force to figure that out. The solution is there are actually what's called reverse ATMs out there where you can put money in and a debit card will be spit out. And people will be using that going forward. And then this afternoon, we had a West Region CFO call where all of the finance people from the major league teams in the AL West and the NL West get together and talk about significant issues that we're dealing with. MLB uses that as their forum to let us know of any financial situation that we need to know about. And then the end of the day was actually dealing with the CFO and my boss and some of our other people as we look to provide information to potential investors in the team. So that's what today looked like. Tomorrow will look completely different. And that's the fun of it. So.
Also, I guess going off of that, so do you work specifically with like player contracts, and what financial factors go into deciding to trade a player, or also like pick up a new player?
I deal somewhat indirectly, I would say, with baseball contracts. A lot of teams, it's interesting. When I was with the Bobcats, I was actually the salary cap guy, which that was interesting when the guy they were reporting to is Michael Jordan. So that made things very interesting. But at the Dodgers, we have enough capacity within baseball ops that they do a majority of the contract work themselves as far as figuring out what the team looks like and what future planning looks like. However, a lot of times they will tend to send me, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing. Can we use you as a double check to make sure as another set of eyes that what they think they're doing is what they're actually doing from a financial perspective. So I do typically get consulted as they're trying to figure out trades, just to make sure, like I said, as another second set of eyes. But yeah, a lot of it is projecting out and trying to figure out, we've got Clayton Kershaw for another year, but after that he falls off. That's an extra $30 million that theoretically we can go out and spend. Do we want to spend it? What do we spend it on? What does it look like? As you're looking at trade components, the funny thing is a lot of people think that a contract is a good thing. Well, their contracts can be a bad thing if they're a bad contract and they hang on forever and ever and ever. Getting rid of a bad contract could actually be valuable, which is something that if you look at typical economics, people look at you and think you're absolutely crazy, but that's the way it is in sports. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. And to be honest, a lot of them tend to be non-financial. So, Mookie Betts was a pretty big investment for us with his new extension. And that was about purely on-field performance. So that's one of those things that he said, you know what, we'll figure out a way to pay for it. We just need to make it happen. So.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the group. So one more question, actually relating to a few weeks ago, this organization, we had a trivia night and Nick actually led it, gave great context and insight to a lot of questions relating to baseball. And one of the debate questions we asked about was if the MLB should have a salary cap. So, we were debating back and forth and, but I think it would be more informed of a perspective if we actually ask someone like you, how would that change the league? I know some leagues have salary caps like the NBA, but how would that change the league and the work that you do?
It would be interesting. I worked in the NBA, and the NBA has a quote unquote salary cap, but it's considered a soft salary cap because there's so many exceptions and ways you can get around the cap that it doesn't really end up being a true salary cap. I will tell you right now that the Major League Baseball Players Union will fight like crazy to make sure that there is never a salary cap because they see what has happened to all the leagues that has a salary cap and the negative effect it has had on player salaries. So they will fight tooth and nail to make sure that it never happens. And you can see, luckily, Major League Baseball, we do have what's called a competitive balance tax, which acts sort of like a luxury tax, but to be honest, the penalties for exceeding it are not that great, to the point where every once in a while you'll see a team that just loads up, Dodgers being one of them about 5 or 6 years ago, and says, you know what, it's worth it for us to go ahead and go over the cap and pay the tax because we think in the end run it's going to be more beneficial for us. I think you can take a look at what's happening in Europe in soccer with the transfer fees and see how crazy the numbers are over there as far as the transfer fees and what's going on there, to see what happens if you have a truly unregulated situation. So you could say that baseball may be kind of that nice in between, although the players will still say they're not paid enough.
Okay, opening it up. Thank you. Opening it up to anyone that wants to ask any specific questions for Greg.
I actually have someone else can go.
Thanks, Nick. Do you think not having a salary cap is ultimately gonna hurt like the competitiveness of some teams? Because I'm a Mariners fan. I know it's not a small market, but like it's nowhere near what like the Dodgers are raking in. So like I'm not expecting the Mariners ever to go out and spend, let's say, on Nolan Arenado. I know he signed a contract, but like they're not gonna be able to take that on. I guess they had to know, but do you think it's gonna ultimately hurt competitiveness?
Well, our way around that is we have a revenue sharing component. So the idea behind the revenue sharing is us big market teams are so financially viable. I say so financially viable as I roll my eyes because I would love to be rolling in money and we're not. But we do have a situation where based on a calculation of what our local revenue is, we then turn around and make a payment to Major League Baseball, who then distributes that to small market teams who don't have the opportunity to get the revenue that we do to help them pay for their salaries and their operations. So if you ask the big teams, we say we're paying too much revenue sharing. If you ask the Tampa Bays of the world, they're not getting enough revenue sharing. But it's kind of interesting that Tampa Bay, who's constantly one of the worst revenue performing teams, managed to be playing us in the World Series last year. So, and I think we have a lot of examples. If you look back, Kansas City was in it a few years ago. Houston, even though it's a big city, doesn't make a ton of revenue. Oakland has been in the playoffs for multiple years now, and it's, even though in the Bay Area, they don't do well financially. So there is hope, I think, for certain teams when you see that, you see those sorts of teams making it into the World Series and doing well in the playoffs, that it happens. So I'd like to think it's not necessarily financial and maybe more an operational issue that teams aren't doing as well as potentially they should.
Yeah, and then one of the big three leagues doesn't have revenue sharing. Is that the NFL?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay.
Hey, Greg, thank you so much for speaking this week. It was fantastic to see you again. So my question, I know I've asked you this before, but I think it'd be really great to talk to the group. But how do you, as a person who's really invested in sports and invested and likes baseball and all the sports you're going to, how do you keep the love of the game or the enjoyment of the game while separating it from the idea that it's also work? Because you go to Dodger Stadium, you go to the office. How does that not turn into, oh, this is work, but I'm actually enjoying the game as well and not being like, I hate baseball now?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I do find that when I work in a particular sport, I end up paying less attention to that sport and more attention to other sports. So, for example, when I was with the Bobcats, basketball became less important and I focused on baseball more, and it's kind of vice versa now. And you alluded to it, the fact that baseball basically equates to work in my mind because I work in baseball. So it is one thing, it's funny, it's kind of antithesis of what you would think. I highly recommend you not work for your favorite team, because one of the things that happens is you let your emotions creep into your work. in that case. So 2017, we finally made it to the World Series, and unfortunately didn't work out. Houston got us in Game 7. I'll let you figure out if it was because of banging trash cans or not. Came into work the next day, and the place was an absolute mausoleum because I work with a bunch of people who grew up in LA as Dodgers fans, and they were absolutely distraught that we got that close and weren't able to pull it off. Meanwhile, I'm running around because I didn't grow up a Dodgers fan. It's like, okay, guys, let's go. We got to get to work. We got to get ready for next year. And people are, laying around completely miserable. So even though a lot of people would love to say they'd love to work for their favorite team, it doesn't end up being as rosy as you would think. So having said that, there's a lot of times when I've been walking around Dodger Stadium and I'm having a really bad day, and I take a look around, it's like, God, why am I doing that? Why, start thinking about grass is always greener. What else could I be doing? And then I'll be walking around the stadium that night at a game, seeing a family, having an absolutely great time. It's like, oh yeah, that's why I'm doing this. I want to be able to create those sorts of memories for people. And I realized, you know what? I'm a pretty lucky guy.
If I could ask a question real quick, I'd like to find out, what are your thoughts on like Moneyball and what the Athletics were able to accomplish in the early 2000s?
Yeah, it's funny. It's in any industry, kind of that first mover effect always comes into play. And, Billy Beane was far and ahead of everybody else. We still have that fight right now, and a lot of people, you're seeing it, especially as, we're becoming successful, the Rays are becoming successful, Houston's becoming successful. A lot of that is because we have probably some of the better baseball analytics departments in baseball. So the idea of kind of trying to figure out where those market inefficiencies are, to use a favorite business school term, and figure out how you can basically take advantage of those inefficiencies to become a stronger and better organization. If you're a business fan, it was absolutely fascinating. If you're a true baseball fan, it's driving you absolutely nuts because it's leading to situations like Blake Snell getting pulled early because that's what the numbers said to do. So I like to think, we're lucky to have Andrew Friedman as our president of baseball operations. I'd like to think, that we have the nice balance of using the analytics to our advantage, but also using gut feel. A lot of people were ready to string our good friend Dave Roberts up for what happened the first 2 World Series. And I think he learned from that, obviously, because he started to use his gut a little bit more in his managerial decisions. And I think that might have been one of the reasons that we were able to pull it off this year as opposed to the previous 2 times.
Absolutely. And I have another, if that's all right too. So like, just as like an average spectator, fan, or athlete or whatever, like we all look at these big, giant pro sports organizations and we're like, oh my gosh, they must be so rich. They're paying these guys millions of dollars and all that. And I think you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but can you explain kind of like how tight or wide maybe some of the margins are financially speaking?
I explain professional sports economics like this, and it seems not to make a lot of sense, but it's the way it is. First of all, it's funny because I go back, get a great degree from UCLA, go get an MBA at the University of Virginia, learn all these things about how to run a business. And the first thing you do when you walk into a sports organization is basically throw that all out the window, because sports organizations are unlike any other business anywhere in the world. But the way professional sports economics go is pay a whole bunch of money for a franchise, typically endure operating losses while you own the franchise, and then when you decide to sell, pray to God that you sell it for more than your original investment and that you're able to recoup all those losses. It's not a situation where you tend to make a lot of money, which sounds ridiculous given the amounts of money that are flowing through it. But I think you'll hear different things here and there. Obviously teams are very protective of their financial information, and Forbes comes back and figures out these franchise valuations, which we kind of snicker at in the background because we kind of know what the heck they really are. They try, they just don't do a very good job. But I know at one point in the NBA, when I was there, I think 24 of the 27 NBA teams at the time were losing money.
Wow.
So, like I said, it's not necessarily a very pretty picture, but that's the way it is.
Yeah. So expanding on that a little bit, what keeps them sustainable?
Typically deep pockets. So it's going to be a lot of times it's the ownership ponying up and saying, okay, I'm willing to spend X much more to be able to make this worthwhile. Now, obviously, you get a run like the Warriors had in the Bay Area with a few world championships in a row, you start doing better. But that's far and away not going to cover typically the losses that you had the years that you didn't win the world championship. So.
Wow, that is very interesting to know, like more of the inside. Thank you for that.
Yep.
So actually, just a little continuous question of what Colleen asked. Do you ever raise debt in an organization to cover these losses, or is it more because it's unexpected to expect the revenue flow, or is it more like less likely to raise debt and just find equity or cash flow from the owners?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It really depends on the organization itself. Some teams decide that they don't want to use their own money, so they do raise debt. Most of the leagues limit the amount of debt that any individual team can raise because they don't want the thing to be completely levered. So there typically are limits to how much debt you can raise. Some teams are able to sustain themselves on whatever income that they do make, but it's fairly rare. So I would say a majority of teams, when you need more money, you make a capital call, you invest more equity, and then you just repeat that process over and over again.
Okay, interesting. And so a quick question. As we at the baseball age, age population getting older and older, it seems like baseball is not successful in pulling in new younger generations in the game. Like, how is Dodgers mitigating that, or is MLB trying to target? I feel like they are trying, but hasn't seen any effect of it. How do you see it? What do you think is the solution to that problem?
Yeah, it was very interesting, and you're exactly right. I think behind probably NASCAR, we have the oldest average fans of any of the major leagues. And yeah, we have definitely identified that, and we're doing a lot of different things. A lot of it is grassroots work. So doing things like the RBI complex that we have in Compton to try to get kids involved in baseball. A lot of that work. And I think there has been, even since I've been, having worked at MLB Advanced Media, where we were kind of the quote unquote technical side of Major League Baseball, and understanding that obviously younger fans are going to be more tech media savvy. A lot of their work is really trying to figure out how we reach out to millennials to get them interested in coming to our games, paying attention to our games, do those sort of things. So to give you an idea, our basically, we have now a digital group, which is actually headed by a UCLA alum, who includes both our social media and just our digital strategy. When I came on board, we had nobody on social media, and we had absolutely no digital strategy whatsoever. We now have a group of, I think, 7 or 8 people within that digital group who's taking a look at both the social side and the digital side as much as we can to get people as involved as they can.
Awesome.
I have a question. And then, I'm Johnny. I'm a third-year stats econ double major. To what extent do because I know obviously, so you have your major league teams that support their minor league affiliates. To what extent does the financial needs of you guys' affiliate teams inform the decisions that you make on a regular basis? And my kind of second part to this question is, I know that there has recently been a push to pay these minor league players higher salaries. And in what ways has the Dodgers taken that push into consideration, and how does that affect your future projections?
Yeah, so minor leagues, it's kind of interesting. It's an interesting setup. Most teams, what happens is you actually the major league team that is the affiliate is a part of will pay the salaries of the players. And then we'll also pay, for the most part, a majority of the baseball operating expenses. And then the affiliate itself gets to keep the revenue from tickets, that sort of thing. And that ends up being, they kind of keep the game day, I'll call it the game day revenues, which they then offset all other expenses they potentially have. And that's kind of how the financial relationship works. A lot of that, and I say it's interesting because the other thing that happens, and we actually did it, is that our ownership group went out and actually bought our AAA and our AA team. So we actually run our own AAA and AA team. So one way to get more control over that is to basically buy the franchise, which is what we did. So we probably have more insight into our AAA and our AA teams than another team who hasn't made that investment. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. As far as paying the minor league players, we were actually one of, I think, 5 or 6 that I heard of that were looking to actually voluntarily increase the payments, the amounts that we were paying our minor leaguers, which would have gone into effect this year. Unfortunately, COVID hit and they didn't have a season, so they didn't get to see the benefit of that. But I think everybody realizes that they are underpaid and we need to make an adjustment. It took a few teams to realize that. And usually one of the things you find out is when 2 or 3 teams do something, the other 27 kind of sit back and see, let's see what happens here. If it ends up working or they feel compelled to, then the other 27 will jump in. I think this is a case where the other 27, when this takes effect, they're going to have to jump in as well.
Actually, going off your last point, I have one more question. Like, to what extent would you say that, like, it really is like a copycat league where you guys kind of like try to cover your secrets and say, like, you know, if you found something that works really well, like, to what degree, like, do you guys go to keep that under wraps? Or is it something where you kind of realize it's going to get out eventually? You know, we shouldn't put that much effort into it.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it depends on what it is that you're talking about. If it's, you know, proprietary software to figure out analytics on the baseball side, you're going to protect it at all costs. On the other side, if you're in my shoes, if you're in the finance department, if I have a question about how to deal with something a financial perspective, my first call is to the finance department of the San Francisco Giants, because typically a lot of these issues either another team has faced, or in the case of, you know, if California, it's a workers' comp issue, somebody in California has probably dealt with it or may have to deal with it. So you immediately call all the teams in California. So we're a very collective group, and it's very weird because you're so competitive on the field, but then you actually open up and do anything you can to help out your colleagues in these other teams in that particular case. So another thing that makes sports interesting is that you can hate each other completely, but then work with each other. So.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Arnav. I'm a second-year biz econ major right now, and I was wondering if you had any questions, like recommendations or experiences, because given that you said that your undergrad and MBA degree really don't prepare you for a job in the sports business industry, like what specific experiences or I guess recommendations you have for students like us that want to get into the world of sports business to, I guess, get better prepared and have that opportunity to explore that?
Yeah, good question. It's one of the things that you can do, and the best you can, and I know it's difficult, is to try to find some sports related experience to do. And one of the things I always try to get people to do is go down to the Morgan Center and volunteer. Say, hey, I'm interested in working with the sports information department. I'm interested in whatever the heck it is, kind of going back to my initial, think about your functional area. Go down to UCLA athletics and say, hey, you know, I'm interested in getting some experience. Is there anything you can do to help me? That's a good starting point. But kind of keeping it, again, going back to the networking thing, talk to people like me, talk to other UCLA alums who work in sports to get an understanding of what it is that they do. And also just to get them on your radar, because, you know, if I hear of something at the Dodgers and all of a sudden I'm talking to, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I just talked to a student who's looking to do this. If I'm the kind of guy that I should be, all of a sudden I should connect the two and make sure you try to get an opportunity to do that. So that's where the networking piece of it comes in to play as well. So those couple of things. And the other thing is also think about, when you think about sports, you don't necessarily need to think about just the leagues and the teams themselves. If you're interested in sponsorship or marketing, Bank of America literally spends tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, on sports marketing every year. So it may be taking a look at a non-sports industry and how they attract and deal with sports. That can also give you experience as well. So you need to kind of keep your eyes open for all sorts of ways to get into sports that way.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question going off of that, but more on the financial side. I'm a second-year applied math major, and there aren't really any direct majors or minors besides accounting at UCLA that would play directly into like a financial analyst, or like other majors at other schools that could go more directly into that sort of a job position. So how did you really learn how to like do that type of work without getting the classwork in school for it?
Yeah, I'll be honest. It's one of those, I really got probably the experience that I used, I got into in the real world as opposed from the classes at UCLA. That's why I kind of go back to my point earlier. It's like, get the most experience, become the best, whatever it is. In your case, you know, if you want to become a financial analyst, get the best financial analyst experience, go work for, like I did, go out and work for a New York Times, a Time Warner, a big company that's going to teach you how to be a financial analyst. And then when that opportunity in sports pops up, you have that set that's going to make you a more attractive candidate when you do come over to the sports world.
Thank you.
Yep.
We had a question in the chat. It's from Charles. It's how much of a challenge was the salary component in this shortened season for the Dodgers and across the league?
Well, I would say that the salary component was probably the most important fact, because that's how we came up with the number of games that we played. So, you know, it's one of those things. Unfortunately, it's the biggest expense on our P&L statement, and trying to pay very large salaries with virtually no revenue coming in is an extreme challenge, to the point where, you know, most of the teams are going to lose even more money than they typically did this year just to be able to put 60 games on. So it is very challenging. There is no question about it. And hopefully, knock on wood, we'll be able to bring fans back sooner rather than later to help us alleviate that going forward.
I have one last question real quick. Do you have like a favorite failure of yours that was like crucial to your journey, that if it didn't happen, you wouldn't be where you're at today?
Yeah, it's fun. It's funny because somebody actually asked me that when I interviewed at NASCAR. I said, you know what? I didn't really have a major failure, and they still hired me because they shouldn't have. I did have one issue, and I think what it taught, it's more a, you know, one of those things that taught me humility more than anything. When I was at the Bobcats, obviously part of my planning was we had a 5-year plan that kind of mapped out where we were. And I found out that I had a fairly major mistake in that model. And people had kind of trusted me to the point where they didn't really check on me. They just assumed that everything I did was directionally correct. And all of a sudden I had this major failure. The thing that taught me is that nobody's bulletproof. And so when I tend to have models like that, I try to get another set of eyes on them, try to get somebody else to take a look at it, because when you're buried deep, deep, deep in the weeds, you're in the forest, you know, the old saying, you can't compare the forest from the trees. When you're down in the trees, you kind of forget about the big picture. So that taught me that no matter how much I might think I'm right, it's always important to get somebody else to get another set of eyes on something that important to make sure that you're doing the right thing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if there's any last questions. I know we're running short on time. It's 6:58, so I want to be mindful. But if there's a last question from anyone, I think all the questions that were asked are really good, though. But if there are any last questions, we can take those.
I mean, yeah, I got one more.
You got one more? Go ahead, Nico.
So, Greg, you said today your meeting was about how to like make your stadium cash free. I'm wondering, like hearing that, I'm wondering how you're setting your priorities. Because right now we're in a phase where like you're not having a lot of fans in stadiums. So why is that something that you're considering in comparison to something that is potentially like more important, being that how are we actually going to get fans into the stadium?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that one of the reasons we're doing that is for safety factors. So there is that initial thinking that if I'm a fan and I see people running around with cash, I'm going to get COVID from handling that cash when I hand it over to the concessionaire, et cetera, et cetera. So believe it or not, that's really a safety issue. And we're thinking that we need to be able to do that to be able to tell our fans we're doing everything we can to protect your safety. Otherwise, they may decide they don't want to come to our games. Therefore, it does become a revenue issue for us.
Oh, awesome. I did not see that connection there, but it makes total sense now.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, well, if that's all the questions we have for today, I want to give a thank you, round of applause for Greg for coming in today, just for you to even sacrifice the time after the past crazy weeks I'm sure you had from the end of that season. So we really appreciate you coming in, answering all the questions that we have, and just having like this unique space to talk to you about your journey and learn from you. So thank you so much, Greg.
Absolutely. Glad to do it.
And one last thing moving forward for the members too, just to share this. So you guys remember before we end next week at the same time, we have Stephanie Strack from Voice in Sport, formerly CEO of Rag & Bone, and also a former Nike executive. So that will be at the same time, same Zoom link, next Thursday, the 12th. Reminder to fill out the attendance policy or the attendance form that Colin put back into the chat. So you get credit for showing up today. If you guys are new with the Sports Business Association, we want to give you guys credit because we have a point system as well. And follow our socials as well to stay in tap. We'll definitely be posting some quotes from some of the advice that Greg gave today on our social media as well, from Instagram to LinkedIn to Twitter to Facebook to YouTube. So we have all of those to bring and share a lot of the fun insights that Greg shared today. So thank you guys all for attending. I know it's right around 7, so I just want to be mindful of time. And thank you once again, Greg, for coming in today.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Greg. Really appreciate it. That was awesome.
Glad to do it, guys. Best of luck with everything.
Yes, sir. Go Bruins.
Go Bruins.
Absolutely.
Hope you guys all have a good, safe night too. See you guys next week.